A black woman, denied service of champagne in first class, has her phone call get the staff fired in minutes. On a seemingly ordinary flight, a well-dressed black woman, Femi, quietly takes her seat in first class. What happens next would leave the entire cabin in stunned silence. When a request for a simple glass of champagne is denied with blatant disrespect, no one expects her calm response to set off a chain of events that would change everything, not just for the flight crew, but for the airline itself. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's a lesson in dignity, accountability, and the unexpected power of staying composed under pressure. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The departure lounge hummed with quiet conversation, the occasional clink of coffee cups punctuating the ambient noise. Femi Okoro sat near the window, her gaze fixed on the runway outside. The morning light poured in, glinting off her sleek carry-on bag and the delicate gold watch adorning her wrist. She adjusted her scarf, a soft blend of cream and gold silk that matched the sophistication of her tailored navy pantsuit. She was calm, poised, and every bit as prepared for the first-class experience she'd purchased. When the boarding call for Flight 719 finally came over the intercom, Femi rose gracefully, clutching her ticket and passport. The gate attendant greeted her with a mechanical smile, waving her forward. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Okoro," the attendant said, though the words lacked warmth. "Thank you," Femi replied, with her signature politeness, stepping onto the jet bridge. The weight of judgmental eyes followed her, as they often did. She was used to it by now, the silent calculations strangers made about who she was, how she got here, and whether she belonged. The first-class cabin was a symphony of understated luxury. The wide, plush seats gleamed in soft leather, each accompanied by its own screen, adjustable lighting, and a privacy partition. Femi felt a flicker of satisfaction as she located her seat, 2A, a window seat. This was her moment of calm, a well-earned indulgence after weeks of grueling work as a consultant for high-stakes mergers. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, then sank into her seat, allowing herself a brief smile. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as a flight attendant breezed by, offering a tray of pre-flight refreshments. "Would you care for orange juice or water?" the attendant asked a passenger 2 rows ahead. Femi waited her turn, flipping open the menu tucked into her armrest. The airline prided itself on its premium service, artisan meals, vintage wines, and, of course, champagne. Her fingers brushed over the embossed lettering on the menu as she pictured the crisp bubbles dancing in her glass. The flight attendants made their rounds, distributing warm towels and offering personalized greetings to passengers. Femi noticed, however, that their smiles seemed brighter for some than for others, a subtle shift in demeanor when they approached her row. "Can I get you anything to start, ma'am?" asked a tall, blonde flight attendant named Brea, her tone polite but holding a sharp edge, the kind that suggested courtesy was an obligation rather than a choice. "Yes, I'd love a glass of champagne," Femi said, her voice even. Brea's expression flickered, an almost imperceptible raising of the brow, a hesitation that wasn't present moments earlier. "Oh," she said, with a feigned sweetness that barely concealed her condescension. "Champagne is for our first-class passengers. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Femi's heart skipped a beat, but her outward demeanor remained calm. She met Brea's gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she replied, producing her ticket and handing it to the attendant. "I'm quite certain." Brea scanned the ticket, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. With a reluctant smile, she handed it back. "Of course, my mistake," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it was a mistake at all. The attendant walked away without fulfilling Femi's request. Femi leaned back in her seat, her fingers tightening briefly around the armrests. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered this kind of treatment, but it stung nonetheless. She had worked tirelessly for every achievement in her life, and yet, in moments like this, it felt as though none of it mattered. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had nothing to prove. Her seat in first class wasn't a privilege. It was her right, just like anyone else who had paid for it. When Brea returned to the row, she began serving champagne to the other passengers. A man in the aisle seat across from Femi, a businessman with a Rolex and a smug grin, winked at Brea as she poured him a glass. Femi caught his amused glance in her direction, his smirk brimming with unspoken commentary. Another flight attendant, Cole, appeared at Brea's side. He glanced at Femi, then leaned in to whisper something. Both attendants shared a quiet laugh before Brea spoke, louder this time. Some people just don't know how to act in first class. The words were not addressed to anyone in particular, but Femi knew they were meant for her. She could feel the weight of eyes on her from the surrounding seats. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others simply watched, entertained by the spectacle. Femi's chest tightened, but she maintained her composure. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her phone. With practiced ease, she tapped the screen and selected a contact. The name on the screen read, Executive Relations, Global Air. When the line connected, Femi's voice was calm, steady, and chillingly formal. Hello, this is Femi Okoro. I'm on Flight 719, and there's a situation I need resolved immediately. Her words cut through the quiet murmurs of the cabin like a blade, and, for the first time, Brea and Cole's smug expressions faltered. The air in the first-class cabin shifted. It wasn't a physical change, but a tension, a crackling, unspoken awareness that something significant had just occurred. Femi Okoro placed her phone back on the tray table, her fingers brushing lightly over the smooth glass surface. Her face remained composed, but her eyes were sharp, her gaze fixed ahead, as though she were calculating her next move. Brea and Cole exchanged uneasy glances. From the galley at the front of the cabin, they huddled together, whispering in hushed tones, occasionally casting quick, furtive looks in Femi's direction. The easy confidence they had displayed moments earlier was beginning to unravel. Femi leaned back in her seat, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She could feel the weight of judgment still hanging in the air, the stares from the other passengers, some curious, others skeptical. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, leaning slightly toward her. Everything all right, ma'am? He asked, his voice tinged with feigned concern. Femi turned to him slowly, her lips curving into a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Yes, thank you for asking, she replied, her tone cordial yet distant. The man shrugged, smirking as he picked up his champagne flute, swirling the liquid lazily before taking a sip. His watch caught the light, a flash of gold that seemed to underline the unspoken arrogance in his demeanor. Just making sure, he added, his words trailing off as he turned his attention back to his tablet. Femi returned her gaze to the window, the clouds outside a serene contrast to the brewing storm inside the cabin. She tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, a rhythm that matched her steady breathing. She was in no hurry. She knew patience often carried more weight than immediate action. Minutes passed, the cabin settling into the quiet hum of preparation for takeoff. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay due to unexpected logistical matters. Brea and Cole's faces tightened at the announcement. Brea moved toward the cockpit, her steps brisk and purposeful, while Cole lingered in the galley, fidgeting with a stack of menus that didn't need arranging. As Brea disappeared behind the cockpit door, another flight attendant approached Femi's seat. This one was younger, with wide eyes and a nervous energy that betrayed her inexperience. She held a tray with water and orange juice, her hands trembling slightly as she stopped beside Femi. Ma'am, would you like a drink while we wait? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Femi regarded the young woman for a moment before shaking her head gently. No, thank you, she replied, her tone soft but firm. The attendant nodded quickly, retreating back to the galley. Femi watched her go, noting the nervous glance the young woman exchanged with Cole. It was clear the crew was on edge, though they didn't yet understand the full weight of what was happening. The cockpit door opened, and Brea emerged, her face pale and tight. She avoided looking at Femi as she hurried to the galley, where Cole immediately pulled her aside. Their whispers grew louder, more frantic, as they debated their next steps. I'm telling you, she called someone important, Cole hissed, his voice carrying just enough for Femi to hear. She's bluffing, Brea snapped back, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. People like her always pull this kind of stunt when they don't get what they want. Cole glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting Femi's before darting away. What if she's not bluffing? Brea didn't respond, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The tension reached a breaking point when a distinct knock echoed through the cabin door. The sound was firm, authoritative, and immediately drew the attention of everyone in first class. The door to the jet bridge opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. His badge, clipped to his lapel, gleamed under the cabin lights. Senior Operations Manager, Global Air. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, curiosity and confusion rippling through the cabin like waves. Brea's face turned ashen as the man approached her directly. "Are you the lead attendant for this flight?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Yes," Brea stammered, her professional composure crumbling under his scrutiny. The manager's gaze flicked to Cole, who had frozen mid-step, holding a tray of glasses. "And you?" "I'm a part of the crew," Cole managed, his voice barely audible. The manager's eyes narrowed. "Step aside. I need to speak with Miss Okoro." As the manager turned toward Femi, his demeanor shifted. His expression softened slightly, and he offered her a polite nod. "Miss Okoro, I deeply apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. I assure you, this matter will be addressed immediately." Femi inclined her head gracefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice measured and calm. The manager gestured for Brea and Cole to join him near the galley, his tone growing firmer. "You two, come with me now." The pair hesitated, but the steel in the manager's voice left no room for argument. They followed him toward the rear of the cabin, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. As the trio disappeared from view, Femi reached for the menu once more, her movements unhurried. The businessman across the aisle watched her, his smirk replaced by a look of uneasy curiosity. "Guess you weren't bluffing," he muttered, half to himself. Femi didn't respond. Instead, she calmly adjusted her scarf, her focus on the horizon outside the window. The clouds were still there, untouched by the chaos unfolding inside. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The storm was just beginning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as Flight 719 finally took off. Despite the turbulence of emotions swirling among the crew and passengers, the airplane climbed steadily, piercing through layers of soft clouds into the clear blue sky. Femi Okoro remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze drifting between the window and the horizon. Outwardly, she appeared serene, but her mind was as sharp and deliberate as ever. Behind her calm exterior, she noted every shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The nervous glances from the other passengers, the hushed whispers that carried fragments of her name, and the uneasy movements of the remaining crew. Approximately 15 minutes after takeoff, the senior operations manager reappeared in the first-class cabin. His stride was purposeful, his expression a blend of authority and apology. In his hands, he carried a silver tray, a single champagne flute balanced carefully atop it. The liquid inside sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Stopping at Femi's seat, he inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Okoro," he began, his voice low but clear, "please accept this as a token of our sincerest apologies. On behalf of Global Air, I assure you we take incidents like this very seriously." Femi turned to face him, her expression neutral, but her eyes unyielding. She regarded the flute for a moment before taking it delicately in her hand. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but distant. She swirled the champagne slightly, watching the bubbles rise before taking a measured sip. The manager remained standing, his posture formal, as though awaiting further instruction. "Is there anything else we can do to make this flight more comfortable for you?" Femi placed the flute on her tray table, folding her hands neatly. "There is," she said evenly. "I'd like a detailed explanation of how such behavior was allowed to occur in the first place. Not later. Now." The manager's composed demeanor faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Of course, Miss Okoro," he replied. "The crew involved has been removed from service and will face immediate disciplinary action upon landing. Their behavior does not reflect the standards we uphold at Global Air." By now, the other first-class passengers were openly watching the exchange. Femi could feel their eyes on her, but she ignored them, focusing entirely on the manager. "Disciplinary action is a start," she said, "but it doesn't address the underlying issue. I've seen enough to know this isn't just about two flight attendants making poor choices. It's about a culture that tolerates their behavior." Her words hung in the air, each one precise and cutting. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, lowering his gaze. A woman, 2 rows back, who had been stifling a smirk earlier, now looked at Femi with wide eyes, her expression unreadable. In the galley, the remaining flight attendants whispered among themselves, their anxiety palpable. Without Brea and Cole to anchor their routine, they moved hesitantly, their usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward Femi, as though gauging the temperature of the situation. Femi noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The nervous shuffle of feet, the tentative way the attendants addressed passengers, the overly polite smiles that now seemed forced. It wasn't guilt they felt, she realized. It was fear. "Excuse me," the businessman across the aisle finally said, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. "I don't mean to intrude, but..." He paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "Are you someone important?" Femi turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. She studied him for a moment before responding, her voice steady. "Important is a relative term," she said. "But let's just say I have the ability to hold people accountable when they fail to meet their obligations." Her response was deliberately ambiguous, leaving the man to draw his own conclusions. He nodded slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a wary respect. "Well," he muttered, "good for you." The senior operations manager cleared his throat, drawing Femi's attention back to him. "Miss Okoro, I'll be conducting a full review of the incident, and you'll receive a comprehensive report within 24 hours. Additionally, the airline would like to offer you compensation for this experience, including a complimentary upgrade on your next flight." Femi tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Compensation is appreciated, but it's not the priority," she said. "What I want is systemic change. Make sure your team understands that discrimination, whether overt or subtle, has no place in your organization. And don't just tell me you'll handle it. Prove it." Her words were calm, but the force behind them was undeniable. The manager nodded earnestly. "You have my word," he said. From her seat, Femi could see a sliver of the galley where Brea and Cole stood, their expressions tense as they spoke with a security officer who had joined the flight just before departure. The officer was jotting down notes on a clipboard, occasionally looking up to address the 2 attendants. Their previously smug attitudes had been replaced by visible apprehension. Brea's lips were pressed into a thin line, while Cole kept shifting from foot to foot, his discomfort clear. The manager excused himself momentarily, disappearing into the galley. A low murmur of conversation followed, punctuated by Brea's raised voice. But it was just a misunderstanding. Her protests were met with a firm response from the manager, though the exact words were inaudible. When the manager returned to Femi's seat, his expression was solemn. "The attendants in question will be disembarked at the next stop and placed on indefinite suspension pending further investigation," he informed her. "We take your concerns very seriously." Femi nodded, her satisfaction tempered by the weight of the moment. She wasn't vindictive. Her goal had never been to humiliate anyone, but she knew the importance of standing up, not just for herself, but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. She picked up the champagne flute again, taking a slow sip. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue, light and crisp, but their taste was secondary to the deeper satisfaction she felt. Justice had been served, swiftly and decisively. As the flight continued, the cabin gradually returned to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere remained charged. Femi turned her attention back to the window, her reflection merging with the clouds beyond. She knew this moment would stay with her, not just as a memory, but as a reminder of what could be achieved with calm persistence and unshakable resolve. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and rhythmic, as if attempting to mask the quiet storm of tension that lingered among the passengers and crew. Despite the calm appearance, the air in the first-class section felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Femi Okoro reclined slightly in her seat, the edges of her scarf draped loosely over her shoulders, a picture of composure. But beneath her calm demeanor, she was processing every detail, every subtle shift in the dynamic around her. She had learned over a lifetime of quiet battles that even in moments of triumph, the real power lay in the aftermath and how the lessons were carried forward or ignored. The champagne flute rested lightly in her hand, though she hadn't taken another sip since the senior operations manager had left her seat. Instead, her thoughts drifted, as they often did in the wake of such confrontations. The weight of moments like these wasn't just personal, it was generational. She thought of her grandmother, who had once worked as a domestic servant in the Deep South, enduring the sharp sting of indignities far worse than being denied a glass of champagne. Her grandmother had taught her that resilience wasn't just about enduring, but about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to endure the same. Don't let them rattle you, her grandmother used to say. Sometimes, quiet strength can shake the ground more than any storm. Those words had stayed with her, guiding her through moments like this. The blatant dismissal, the patronizing smiles, the whispered comments. They weren't new to her, but she had learned how to respond, not with fury, but with calculated precision. The businessman across the aisle, who had been unusually quiet since his earlier comment, shifted in his seat. Femi noticed him glancing her way, his curiosity bubbling over. Finally, he cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her, though not enough to breach the invisible wall of her personal space. Just wanted to say, he began, hesitating. I didn't mean any offense earlier. It's just, you handled that remarkably well. I don't think I would have kept my cool like that. Femi turned her head slowly, her expression measured. For a moment, she let the silence hang, watching the man squirm under her gaze. Then, she smiled, just enough to diffuse the tension. Thank you, she said simply, her tone polite but not inviting. The businessman nodded quickly, as if relieved to have cleared the air, and settled back into his seat. His demeanor had softened. The earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by something that almost resembled respect. In the galley, the remaining crew moved with visible caution. Their usual rhythm, swift, practiced, efficient, was now halting and uncertain. Each movement seemed overly deliberate, as though they feared doing anything that might draw attention or provoke further scrutiny. Femi watched them out of the corner of her eye, noting the way their gazes darted toward her before quickly looking away. They were unsettled, perhaps realizing that the ground they had thought so stable beneath them could shift at any moment. At one point, the youngest attendant, the one who had nervously offered her water earlier, approached with a tentative step. She held a small tray of assorted snacks, her hands trembling slightly. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Would you like anything else? We have a fresh selection of hors d'oeuvres if you're interested." Femi looked up at the young woman, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a nod, she said, "Thank you. I'll have the smoked salmon." The attendant placed the plate carefully on Femi's tray table, her relief evident as she retreated. Femi's eyes followed her for a moment, noting the contrast between her timid demeanor and the bold arrogance Brea and Cole had displayed earlier. As the flight neared its first scheduled stop, a layover in Denver, the atmosphere shifted again. The captain made an announcement, his tone professional but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief stop in Denver to address a crew-related matter. This won't affect your overall travel time, and we appreciate your patience." The murmurs began almost immediately. Passengers exchanged confused glances, some leaning into hushed conversations. Femi remained still, her face calm, but she felt the ripple of discomfort spreading through the cabin. From her seat, she could just make out the figures of Brea and Cole at the rear of the plane, standing stiffly as the security officer spoke to them. Their postures were defensive, their faces pale and drawn. Brea gestured animatedly, her hands slicing through the air, while Cole stood with his arms crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line. When the plane landed and the cabin door opened, two uniformed airport officials boarded swiftly. They walked directly to the back of the cabin, their presence commanding immediate attention. Moments later, Brea and Cole were escorted off the plane, their faces burning with humiliation. Passengers craned their necks to watch, some whispering to one another, others openly gawking. Femi kept her gaze fixed ahead, her expression impassive. This wasn't a spectacle to her, it was accountability. After the plane resumed its journey, the senior operations manager returned to Femi's seat. This time, his demeanor was slightly more relaxed, though still professional. "Miss Okoro," he said, "I wanted to personally thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We're committed to ensuring incidents like this don't happen again." Femi inclined her head. "I hope so," she replied. "It's easy to make promises in the moment. The challenge is following through when no one is watching." The manager nodded solemnly, acknowledging the weight of her words. Then, Almost hesitantly, he handed her a small envelope. This is a formal letter of apology from the airline, along with details of the corrective actions we've taken. If there's anything further we can do, please don't hesitate to reach out. Femi accepted the envelope without opening it, placing it neatly on her tray table. Thank you, she said, her tone measured. As the plane continued its journey, the cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. The murmurs faded, replaced by the soft rustle of newspapers and the occasional clink of glassware. Femi gazed out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the blue expanse of sky. She thought again of her grandmother, of the countless small victories that had paved the way for moments like this. The battle wasn't over, she knew that, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about a glass of champagne, it never had been. It was about dignity, about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. The clouds rolled by, endless and serene. As the plane carried Femi toward her destination, she leaned back in her seat, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since boarding. The storm had passed, but the lessons it left behind would linger. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, its engines a soft hum beneath the subtle creaks and shifts of the cabin. The aftermath of the earlier confrontation hung in the air, invisible yet palpable. Although the other first-class passengers returned to their routines, there was a new dynamic, a quieter, more restrained tone. The world around Femi Okoro seemed to tiptoe now, careful not to disturb the calm she had reclaimed. Femi folded the formal apology letter, slipping it into her leather portfolio with meticulous care. She had yet to examine its contents thoroughly, knowing that the real proof of its sincerity would come not in words, but in actions. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the clouds outside formed an endless sea of white, broken only by the occasional gleam of sunlight. The flight attendant from earlier, the young woman who had brought Femi her smoked salmon, reappeared. This time, without a tray. She hesitated at the edge of Femi's row, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began softly, her voice almost drowned out by the quiet murmurs of the cabin. Femi turned her head, offering the woman a neutral expression. "Yes." The attendant swallowed, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands before she continued. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how things happened earlier." She hesitated, then added, "I should have stepped in or done something. I didn't, and I regret that." For a moment, Femi said nothing. She studied the young woman, noting the faint flush on her cheeks, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. There was sincerity in her voice, but also fear of consequences, of guilt unspoken. "You're young," Femi said finally, her tone measured but not unkind. "It's easy to be swept along by the actions of others, especially when you're unsure of your own footing. But remember this, doing nothing can speak as loudly as the wrong actions. In situations like these, silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity." The attendant's eyes widened, her lips parting as though to respond, but no words came. Femi's gaze softened, just slightly. "You're here now," she continued. "That's a start. But next time, act sooner." The woman nodded quickly, her shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and understanding. "Thank you," she murmured before retreating to the galley. As the young attendant disappeared from view, Femi felt the eyes of the other passengers on her again. Some stared openly, while others darted quick, furtive glances before pretending to return to their books or tablets. She could sense their curiosity, their unspoken questions. Across the aisle, the businessman shifted again, leaning toward her with a faintly apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he began, his voice lowered as though sharing a secret. "But I think you handled all this incredibly well." Femi turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Handled what?" she asked, her tone even but pointed. He blinked momentarily, caught off guard. "You know, the whole thing with the crew. I mean, most people would have lost their cool or made a huge scene, but you were composed. Impressive, really." Femi's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "And yet, it required a phone call for anyone to take notice," she said. "Would it have impressed you if I'd raised my voice? If I'd demanded immediate action, instead of waiting for someone to connect the dots about who I am?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it, his face reddening slightly. "Well," he stammered, "I suppose not." "Exactly," Femi said, her tone soft but firm. It shouldn't take a title or influence to be treated with dignity. What's impressive is how easily people excuse bad behavior until it happens in front of the wrong audience. The businessman nodded slowly, his gaze dropping. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'll remember that." An hour into the flight, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his uniform immaculate, his expression carefully professional. As he entered the first-class cabin, the passengers looked up, their curiosity rekindled. Stopping at Femi's seat, he removed his cap, holding it under one arm as he inclined his head. "Miss Okoro," he began, his tone respectful. "I wanted to personally apologize on behalf of myself and my team for the events earlier today. What happened should never have occurred, and I'm deeply sorry for the treatment you received." Femi regarded him for a moment, her face inscrutable. "Thank you," she said finally. "It's appreciated, but words alone don't fix systemic problems." The captain nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I understand," he said. "And I assure you, steps are being taken to address this, starting with enhanced training for all crew members. We want every passenger, regardless of background, to feel welcome on our flights." Femi's gaze didn't waver. "Training is a good start," she said, "but it's not just about education. It's about accountability. Make sure your team knows that actions have consequences." The captain inclined his head again. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We're committed to that." With that, he excused himself, returning to the cockpit. As the plane cruised through the sky, the cabin gradually settled into an almost fragile sense of normalcy. Passengers resumed their conversations and distractions, though the earlier tension lingered in the air like a shadow. Femi, meanwhile, allowed herself a moment to relax. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly, the soft hum of the engines lulling her into a meditative calm. She didn't need a standing ovation, nor did she crave recognition. For her, the victory wasn't in the public apologies or the letters of compensation. It was in knowing she had shifted the balance, even slightly, in favor of dignity and respect. The world didn't change in a day, but it did change in moments, small, steady ripples that could grow into waves. And Femi Okoro knew how to create ripples. The plane drifted high above the earth, a tranquil bubble suspended in the endless blue sky. The occasional clink of glasses or rustle of newspapers broke the cabin silence, but the first-class section was quieter than usual. Conversations were subdued, marked by half-finished sentences and glances that didn't linger. Even the most self-assured passengers seemed hesitant to speak too loudly, as though still digesting the events that had unfolded. Femi Okoro sat in her seat, her posture as poised as ever. She wasn't one to revel in discomfort, even when it was deserved, but she could feel the shift in energy around her. A sense of unease hung in the air, not just from the crew, but from the passengers as well. It wasn't guilt that unsettled them, it was reflection. The remaining flight attendants moved with a newfound caution. Their steps were measured, their interactions meticulously polite. One of them approached Femi again, this time carrying a small tray with an assortment of petit fours. "Miss Okoro," the young attendant said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "would you like a dessert? These are from the chef's special menu for first class." Femi glanced at the tray, noting the arrangement of delicately crafted sweets. Her gaze flickered to the attendant's face, which was earnest but strained, as though she carried the weight of her entire crew on her shoulders. "Thank you," Femi replied, selecting a small chocolate tart. Her fingers brushed the edge of the plate lightly, as she added, "I hope this hasn't been too overwhelming for you." The attendant blinked, her surprise evident. "Oh, she hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to respond honestly. "It's been different, but I'm learning a lot." Femi smiled faintly. "Good," she said. "Growth often starts in moments like these. Don't forget that." The attendant nodded quickly, her expression a mix of gratitude and nervousness, before retreating to the galley. Not long after, a middle-aged woman seated a few rows back leaned forward, addressing Femi directly. Her hair was impeccably styled, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive. She had remained silent for most of the flight, but now she seemed unable to contain herself any longer. "Excuse me," the woman began, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of awkwardness. "I couldn't help but notice how composed you were earlier. I don't think I would have handled it as gracefully." Femi turned her head slowly, her expression neutral but attentive. "I've had practice," she said, her voice steady. The woman hesitated, as though uncertain whether to probe further. Finally, she added, "If you don't mind me asking, how do you stay so calm? I mean, in situations like that." Femi's gaze softened slightly. "I remind myself of what's at stake," she replied. "Reacting emotionally might feel good in the moment, but it rarely leads to lasting change. The real power is in staying focused and measured." The woman nodded thoughtfully, her eyes dropping to her hands. "That's admirable," she murmured. "I think a lot of us could learn from that." Femi didn't respond immediately, allowing the words to settle. Then, with a faint smile, she said, "It's something we all have to learn and relearn." As the flight neared its cruising midpoint, the senior operations manager returned to Femi's seat. This time, he carried a tablet, the screen glowing softly with a document he had prepared. "Miss Okoro," he began, his tone more confident than earlier, but still deferential. "I wanted to update you on the steps we're implementing based on today's events. May I?" Femi gestured for him to proceed, her expression attentive. He tapped the screen, scrolling through bullet points as he spoke. "Effective immediately, all global air crew members will undergo additional bias training, focused on inclusivity and professionalism. We'll also be revising our onboard service protocols to ensure every passenger receives equal treatment, regardless of perception." Femi nodded slightly, but said nothing, prompting him to continue. "We've also created an expedited reporting system for incidents like these," the manager added. "If any passenger feels mistreated, they'll be able to report it directly to senior management, without delay." "That's a good start," Femi said after a moment. "But protocols are only as effective as the people enforcing them. How will you ensure accountability at all levels?" The manager's face tightened, though not unkindly. "We're implementing stricter performance reviews for our crew," he said. "Any violations of our standards will result in immediate consequences, up to and including termination." Femi regarded him carefully, her silence stretching just long enough to make him shift slightly. "Finally," she said, "follow through on those promises, and you might actually make a difference." The manager nodded, his relief visible, as he excused himself and returned to the galley. Though Brea and Cole had been escorted off the flight hours earlier, their absence lingered like a shadow over the crew. Every interaction between the attendants and the passengers seemed more deliberate now, more carefully considered. Femi could feel the ripple effect spreading, subtle but undeniable. She knew Brea and Cole's termination wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a messagito to the crew, to the passengers, and to the airline itself. People might forget individual moments, but they rarely forgot the consequences of those moments. Later, as the flight approached its destination, the young attendant returned to Femi's seat one final time. She stood there for a moment, her hands clasped tightly together, as though summoning the courage to speak. "Miss Okoro," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything. It made me realize how important it is to speak up when something's wrong." Femi studied the young woman for a moment, her expression softening. "That's good to hear," she said. "But remember, words are only the first step. Actions are what truly matter." The attendant nodded earnestly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'll remember that," she promised, before retreating once more. As the plane began its descent, Femi gazed out the window, watching as the sprawling city below came into focus. The skyline shimmered in the golden light of the setting sun, a quiet reminder of the world waiting beyond this moment. For the rest of the passengers, this flight would become a fleeting story, something to tell friends over dinner or to think about during quiet moments. But for Femi, it was part of a larger narrative, one she had been writing her entire life. The wheels touched down smoothly, and the plane slowed to a gentle crawl along the runway. Femi gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As she stepped off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge met her, a refreshing contrast to the enclosed tension of the cabin. She walked forward, each step a reminder of the strength it took to remain steadfast in the face of injustice. This wasn't the end of her journey, merely another chapter. The ripples, she knew, would continue to spread. The jet bridge was quiet as Femi stepped onto the polished airport floor, her heels clicking softly against the tiles. The other passengers followed at a distance, their movements subdued, as though the tension from the plane still clung to them. She adjusted her scarf and pulled the handle of her leather carry-on, her mind already shifting to the next steps. As she moved through the terminal, Femi felt the weight of her actions pressing gently on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of responsibility. Every decision, every word spoken on that plane, was part of a greater ripple effect, one that had begun to stretch beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. Once through the terminal, Femi made her way to a quiet corner near the lounges. The airport buzzed around her announcements over the PA system, the rolling of suitcases, the chatter of travelers, but she tuned it all out. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to her contact list, selecting a number labeled Grandma. The familiar ringtone hummed in her ear, and soon, a warm, familiar voice answered. "Femi, sweetheart," her grandmother said, her tone immediately softening with affection. "How was your flight?" Femi smiled faintly, leaning back against the wall. "Eventful," she replied, her voice calm but laced with meaning. "Let's just say I had to remind a few people what dignity looks like." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low, knowing hum. "Oh, I see," her grandmother said. "Another one of those moments, Yes," Femi replied. "But this one felt different. More public, more immediate. And how did you handle it?" "Calmly," Femi said, her tone steady. "At least, I think I did. I didn't want to meet fire with fire, but I also wasn't going to let it slide." Her grandmother chuckled softly, the sound like a bomb. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age. You've got the grace to rise above, but you still know how to stand firm. That's a rare balance, Femi." Femi's chest tightened slightly at the compliment. "I learned from the best," she said. "You taught me everything I know about resilience." Her grandmother's voice softened further. "And you've taken it further than I ever dreamed. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, so proud." After ending the call, Femi checked her email. A notification from Global Air Corporate Relations sat at the top of her inbox, marked urgent. Opening it, she found a detailed message from the senior operations manager she had spoken with earlier. The email outlined the immediate actions the airline had taken following the incident. Brea and Cole's termination. Both attendants had been removed from service and would face further review. Bias training rollout. A company-wide training initiative was being expedited, starting with high-traffic routes like the one Femi had flown. Policy revision. A full review of service protocols was underway, with plans to implement mandatory checks for equitable treatment across all passenger classes. At the bottom of the email was a personal note. "Miss Okoro, we deeply regret that this situation ever occurred and want to thank you for your grace and patience in addressing it. Please know that your feedback has already prompted meaningful change within our organization. If there is anything further we can do, you have my direct line. Sincerely, Daniel Carter, Senior Operations Manager, Global Air." Femi read the note twice, her eyes lingering on the words, meaningful change. She wanted to believe it was genuine, but she also knew how easily promises could fade once the moment passed. As Femi moved toward the baggage claim, a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Miss Okoro." She turned to see the young flight attendant from earlier, the one who had brought her the dessert, standing a few feet away. Her uniform was still crisp, but her posture was less rigid, more uncertain. Sorry to bother you," the woman stammered. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything. Watching you handle all that," she trailed off, her cheeks flushing. "It gave me a lot to think about." Femi regarded her for a moment, her expression softening. "Good," she said. "Thinking is where it starts. But don't stop there." The young woman nodded quickly, her eyes bright. "I won't," she promised, before hurrying off to rejoin her crew. Femi watched her go, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. Change didn't always happen in grand, sweeping gestures. Sometimes, it started with a single person quietly deciding to be better. Weeks later, Femi received a follow-up from Global Air, a detailed report outlining the progress they had made since her flight. The email described new training modules, stricter accountability measures, and even testimonials from other passengers who had noticed improvements in service. The airline invited Femi to join an advisory panel to help shape their ongoing efforts toward equity and inclusivity. She accepted, knowing that her involvement could help ensure the promises weren't just empty words. Sitting in her home office one evening, Femi opened her grandmother's favorite journal, a collection of handwritten reflections and advice passed down through generations. On the inside cover, a single phrase was written in her grandmother's elegant script. "The ripples you create today will shape the currents of tomorrow." Femi ran her fingers over the words, her mind drifting back to the flight, to the faces of the passengers, the crew, and the young attendant who had thanked her. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, Femi allowed herself to feel the quiet satisfaction of having made the kind of ripple her grandmother would be proud of. And she knew, somewhere, those ripples were already growing into waves. And so, what started as an act of quiet discrimination ended with a powerful ripple of accountability and change. Femi's story reminds us all that dignity and courage can challenge even the most ingrained biases. If you found this story as inspiring as we did, make sure to like, share, and hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.